Us now, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. Secretary, you say that there should be exceptions in hotspots around the country, but that the general rule should be that schools should be fully operational and fully open in the fall. What does that mean when you talk about fully open? Does that mean in person 5 days a week?
Well, Chris, we know that for kids getting back to school and getting back to learning, getting back with their peers, with their teachers is really imperative. And fully operational and fully functioning means that kids can be back there. And if for families that need their kids in school in person 5 days a week, that has to be an option. But so the point needs to be, how do kids get back to learning in the fall full time, and how do we ensure that they get a full year plus of learning? They've fallen behind this spring. We need to ensure they're back in a classroom situation wherever possible and whenever possible, and fully functioning, fully learning.
Since President Trump and you started calling, and you may really increase the push this week for full school reopenings, there has been sharp pushback from governors and mayors and teachers unions. Here is some of that.
If anybody sat here today and told you that they could reopen the school in September, that would be reckless and negligent of that person.
I double dog dare Donald Trump to sit in a class of 39 sixth graders and breathe that air without any preparation for how we're going to bring our kids back safely.
Reckless and negligent. Secretary, how do you respond?
Well, Chris, there's nothing in the data that suggests that kids being in school is in any way dangerous. We know that children contract and have the virus at far lower incidence than any other part of the population. And we know that other countries around the world have reopened their schools and have done so successfully and safely, and kids there are going back to school every day. And so that has got to be the posture here. Parents are expecting that this fall their kids are going to have a full-time experience with their learning, and we need to follow through on that promise.
All right, let's pick up on this whole issue, and I want to get to the other countries and what's the experiences there in a moment. But this week, the president called out the CDC guidance that has been issued about reopening schools. He put this tweet. I want to put the tweet up. He called the guidance by the CDC on reopening schools, quote, very tough and expensive and very impractical. So let's go through specifically what the CDC is calling for. They say, wash your hands regularly, stay 6 feet apart, and wear a mask. Is that tough, expensive, and impractical, Secretary?
Well, these seem to be measures that we're taking pretty much everywhere else in life, and they're common sense approaches. And as Dr. Redfield has noted, the guidelines are also that, guidelines. They're meant to be helpful as in a posture of how you actually do things and how you actually move ahead and ensure that kids can get back into school. And as he's also noted, the CDC never recommended that schools close in the first place. And so I think we need to be oriented around how do we do this, not if we do. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how we reopen schools and how kids get back to learning full time.
But Secretary, I want to get to this issue because the President of the United States said that the CDC guidelines were tough, expensive, and impractical. I want to look at some of the other CDC guidance. They talked about putting up shielding in places where 6 feet of distance is not possible, plastic shielding. They talked about staggered drop-offs and pickups. Is that tough, expensive, and impractical?
Well, again, all of the guidelines are meant to be helpful to help local education leaders decide and work on how they are going to accomplish what they need to do, and that is getting kids back in school based on their situation and their realities. We know that schools across the country look very different, and that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to everything. But the key is there has to be a posture of doing something, of action, of getting things going, putting a plan together for your specific school, for your specific district, or for your classroom that ensures that kids are going to start learning again this fall.
Well, I think we all agree that kids need to learn, and that to the degree possible, we want to get them back to school. The question is, how do you balance safety and learning? You have cited the American Academy of Pediatrics and a report that they issued, which said indeed that students do need to get back to school, and that there are real costs to the students in terms of not getting back to school. But that association issued a new report on Friday along with the teachers' unions, and I want to put up what they said there. They said science should drive decision-making on safely reopening schools. Public health agencies must make recommendations based on evidence, not politics. They say leave it to the health experts to say when schools should reopen in various localities.
Well, I'm glad you cited the American Academy of Pediatrics, because they also have noted that this whole question of school and going back to school in the fall is one of health for students. And there are multiple measures for student health. We know, and as Secretary Azar said, this is a question of health versus health, not health versus something else. We know that kids are suffering mentally with many mental issues. We know that kids are suffering with socio-emotional learning issues. We know that kids from vulnerable populations and homes have been suffering by not being in school and by not continuing their learning. All of those are measures that have to be weighed along with the risk of a virus. And we know, again, from the data that kids don't get this virus the same way adults do. And so, again, the
do we know
posture
about
needs
how they
to be
spread the
around
virus?
going back
Because
to
I've been
school.
told the science there isn't so clear, Secretary. How they spread the virus, conceivably to their parents, to their grandparents, to teachers in the school, to custodians in the school. Do we know that?
Well, that is something that is obviously continuing to be looked at and studied. And there's, again, a lot of data that suggests that kids are not spreaders. But the point is that kids have got to get back to school, and we can do that safely. And every community, every school can look at what their actual physical circumstances are and figure out ways to do this safely. We're doing it in many other areas of life. If we can get back in other areas of life, we certainly need to get back to school. Kids cannot afford to not continue learning. Our nation can't afford to have kids not learning and preparing for their future.
Secretary DeVos, we have found the cost of getting back to regular life. I mean, we in a lot of states, particularly in the South and the Southwest, we reopen bars, we reopen restaurants, we reopen gyms, and we've seen a spike in cases that is almost double what we had in the height of the spring. So it's not like reopening is an answer. In many cases, it creates new problems. And you mentioned earlier about other countries. You and the president have both said, well, other countries are reopening. So let's look at the statistics there if we can. Let's put them up on the screen. Germany reported 378 new cases on Friday. Denmark, 30. Norway, 11. Meanwhile, the U.S. reported 68,226 new cases on Friday. Question, is it really fair? Is it reasonable to compare the situation in countries that have 20 new cases in a day with a country that has 68,000 new cases in a day?
Well, we're talking about schools and other countries' experiences with reopening schools. And it has been shown to be very successful. Kids have gone back to learning environments and have done so safely and
But schools
healthily.
happen in an environment. If there's 30 cases in a state, in a country, that's very different than a place where it's out of control and there are 70,000 new cases in a day.
And we're not talking about places where it's, quote, out of control. We're talking about the rule, not the exception. And where there are hot spots in the future, in the fall, of course, that has to be dealt with differently. And I would reference Miami-Dade County, which has a very robust continuity of learning plan that was put into place in anticipation of hurricanes, but it's very appropriate here. The state of Florida has said in the fall, parents and students need to be able to count on a 5-day-a-week in-person school situation. And where those parents or where that situation suggests something else for a short period of time, there have to be plans to have learning continue 100% of the time, full time, in a different setting. So Miami-Dade has multiple platforms for students to continue to learn.
I have one last question, Secretary DeVos, because both you and the president have threatened to cut off funding for school systems that don't open fully in the fall. Here you are.
If schools aren't going to reopen again, that's breaking that promise. And so why should they receive funds for something they're not going to do?
And President Trump tweeted Friday, schools must be open in the fall. If not open, why would the federal government give funding? It won't. Two quick questions, and I need a quick answer, if I can, from you, Secretary DeVos. One, under what authority are you and the president going to unilaterally cut off funding, the funding that's been approved from Congress, and most of the money goes to disadvantaged students or students with disabilities? And secondly, isn't cutting off funding exactly the wrong answer? Don't you want to spend more money to make schools safer, whether it's with plastic shields or health checks, various other systems? Doesn't it make more sense to increase funding for schools where it's unsafe rather than cut off funding?
Look, American investment in education is a promise to students and their families. If schools aren't going to reopen and not fulfill that promise, they shouldn't get the funds. Then give it to the families to decide to go to a school that is going to meet that promise.
Well, you can't do that. I mean, I know you guys support vouchers, and I know you support vouchers, and that's a reasonable argument, but you can't do that unilaterally. You have to do that through Congress.
Well, we're looking at all the options because it's a promise to the American people, to students and their families, and we want to make sure that promise is followed through on.
Secretary DeVos, thank you. Thanks for your time. Please come back. This is an important subject. A lot of parents care about it.